Hello, my name is Logan Leppick. I'm standing outside of Munn Ice Arena on the campus of Michigan State University, the university in which I attend. My first weekend of college, me and a few kids I met up at school, we went to Munn Ice Arena for an open skate night where students could rent ice skates and skate on the floor. As I was waiting in line, there was a woman behind us, and I decided to talk to her. I was asking her where she was from, how her day was going, and she asked me where I was from, how my day was going. But after I told her that I was from Howell, Michigan, you could see something in that conversation clearly change. Her mood changed, and a few minutes later, she ended up getting out of line and walking away. You could clearly tell that after I told her I was from Howell, Michigan, she had an image in her head about who I was, based on the connotation around it. A few months later, I enrolled in a cultural anthropology class here at Michigan State University. This is where I first learned about the connotation of names within a classroom setting. We learned that names aren't just what you call places, people, or things. They connect that place, person, or thing to certain values or certain perceptions about that place. This is also where we learned about the power of generalization, and that generalizations can hurt people within that group that you are generalizing. Relating this back to Howell, Michigan, the community of Howell has the connotation that connects the name Howell, Michigan to the Ku Klux Klan. Additionally, people on the outside of Howell, Michigan generalize the entire community as a racist area because of this Ku Klux Klan connotation. It was in this classroom setting that I decided that I wanted to conduct research on why Howell, Michigan has a connotation associated with the Ku Klux Klan, and why the community gets generalized as the Klan capital of the state. It was with this research in mind that I traveled back to Howell, Michigan to interview Howell Public Schools School Board Vice President Stacy Piscini, longtime Howell resident and school board representative Brent Earl, as well as journalist Buddy Morehouse, to find out where this name connotation comes from, if the generalizations are fair, and if they're accurate. Additionally, I interviewed two outsiders of the community. I interviewed Michigan State University student Demetrius Tyson from Detroit, Michigan, and MSU student Sophia Holdick from Farmington Hills, Michigan. So the whole idea behind interviewing those on the outside of the community is I'm going to ask them questions like, when you hear the word Howell, what do you first think of? And we're going to get a general idea of what outsiders actually think of when they hear Howell to get an idea of the true connotation behind it. After that, we're going to go and interview those on the inside of the community to think about this connotation. And then we're going to get a look at the accurate history behind it to see where this comes from, how it spreads till today, and if it's fair and if it's accurate. When it's all said and done, I hope this research can limit the impacts that it has on both groups and can help build a better tomorrow. On top of this, we're going to learn about name connotations in the process and how the generalizations of a community can hurt those inside of it, and that name connotation can hurt those on the outside of it as well. With that being said, we have over 40 years of history to dive into, so we don't have any time to waste. Let's get moving back to Howell, Michigan to see where this name connotation comes from. Well, we've made it here to Howell, Michigan. I'm standing on the lawns in front of the historic Howell Courthouse to talk to you guys about the connotation and the history behind Howell. But before we get into that history and the accurate history of it, let's hear what our outsiders think of when they hear the words Howell, Michigan.
I'm Sophia Holdwick.
Hi, my name is Demetrius Tyson.
Where are you from, Sophia?
Farmington Hills, Michigan.
I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan.
So would you consider yourself an outsider to the Howell community?
I am an outsider.
Definitely an outsider.
When I say the word Howell, what immediately pops in your head? What's the first thing that pops in your head?
KKK.
The KKK?
Yes.
Like KKK, like racist, like people.
Why does it link to the KKK? Where does this come from?
Because the KKK started in Howell.
That's what, did you hear like stories about it? Did you see
Yeah,
media?
that's what my mom told me.
Linked the two instantly. 'Cause
Gotcha.
somebody told me when I was a kid, like, how's the KKK capital of Michigan or something of that sort. And so ever since then, that's just been the connotation.
Yeah.
We've just always been told the KKK started in Howell.
Gotcha. So do you know anything about Howell's past with the KKK? Anything about the history about it? Just you hear the name and just associate
Howell,
it?
KKK. Yeah.
Gotcha.
For the most part.
For those on the outside of the community, the message is fairly consistent. The outsiders most of the time associate Howell, Michigan with the Ku Klux Klan. However, when I ask insiders of the community who currently live here and have been representatives of the community for a few years, they think it depends on that person's experience, what their association with Howell actually is.
Pretend you're an outsider from the community and you hear the word Howell. What do you think an outsider thinks of when they hear that word?
I think it's probably mixed.
I think it depends on whether or not they've been here.
I mean, you probably get they've never heard of it. You have to pull your hand up like a Michigan person and point to where it is in the state. You'll get folks that maybe know somebody from around the area. Some folks that will hear or know of some history, some negative history, and that they kind of got a negative response when they hear the name because it's associated with some historical things that happened in the past that don't exist anymore.
People who have been to Howell, who spent any amount of time here, probably have a different opinion than people who just hear the name. But yeah, people particularly get a negative connotation because there has been this stigma for, going on 40 years now that Howell is a hotbed of racism, and specifically that Howell is like the home of the Ku Klux Klan in Michigan. And none of that is true.
So I believe that there's a connotation of it being negative.
But once they see the community, once they get to meet the people, get beyond just the name and the reputation, they probably have a very different connotation.
For 22 years, and I've never seen some of the things that I know existed prior to becoming here.
But it's not. There is no Klan in Howell. There are no hate groups in Howell. It's a very welcoming community. The community of Howell as a whole does not deserve the reputation that it has.
As we heard Mr. Morehouse say, Howell does not deserve the reputation that it gets. Yet, it still does. It leads us to wonder where this connotation was born from and how it lasts all the way to today. Many people believe that the Ku Klux Klan was born in Howell and that Howell is the KKK capital of Michigan, but in reality, those are not true. The KKK was born in Tennessee, and Howell's never actually had a Klan. It's only ever had a Klansman. One single man. This man is where Howell's got his reputation from. His name was Robert Miles, and he was the Grand Dragon of the KKK, and he lived 15 miles north of Howell, Michigan. Livingston County journalist Buddy Morehouse did know Robert Miles, and can provide us with a very unique insight on who he was, and how he's impacted Howell's reputation negatively throughout the years because of his racist, evil actions.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did know him. The thing that made him so scary, I mean, you look at what he did. He was an evil man for what he did. Tarring and feathering another human being, bombing buses, terrorizing people. Not just the things, he didn't just think evil thoughts, he did evil things. He was a bad man. What made him so scary is that when he was extremely well-spoken and articulate, he didn't come off like this rube or this idiot, using bad language and everything like that. He was well educated, and he came off like it, and he was charismatic, and that's part of why he was so powerful within the white supremacist movement, is that he was such an effective spokesperson for them.
He felt that if he could stir up enough press and enough notoriety, that it would become a wider community. Just because he's saying all these things and it's scaring people of color away from the community.
He had that combination of he was an evil person. He did absolutely terrible things. He was so charismatic that he was able to get people to follow him. So somebody that's that evil and that well spoken makes them even more dangerous, I thought.
As we can see, Robert Miles was clearly an evil, evil man. But what's really interesting is that Robert Miles did not live in Howell during his time with the KKK. He actually lived in a small town called KKK, which is approximately 15 miles north of downtown Howell, which is where we are right now, and 10 miles north of Mr. Earl's house where he had his sit-down interview.
You have to remind people that it was one person that lived not even in Howell. He lived in KKK, which is X number of miles, 10 miles north of here. One really bad guy, one bad apple, made the whole bushel bad.
Originally from New York. He moved here in the early 60s to take a job with an insurance company. I think it was Citizens Insurance Company. When he first came to work for Citizens, he did live in Howell. He had a place right on Grand River where he lived. But at that point, he was not actively involved with the Klan. But it wasn't until the 70s when he was arrested and convicted of a couple of crimes And by that time, he had moved to the farm in Cohocton that he really became known. So he did live in Howell, but when he was the Grand Dragon and he was heavily involved with the clan, he lived in Cohocton, which is not in Howell, which is, 15, where he lived was about 15 miles from downtown Howell.
So if Robert Miles lived in Cohocton, which is 15 miles north of Howell, Michigan, it makes you question, how does his time with the Klan when he lived in Cohocton get associated with Howell, Michigan?
It's a matter of geography and semantics.
Cohocton has one stop sign. There's nothing there, and so Howell's the county seat. Howell's the closest town. Anyway, it's just we're the biggest town near Cohocton.
When reporters came to interview him, the closest town to Detroit where they would come up and like stay in a hotel to be able to go out there was Howell. When it came to putting their date line on the story, which is the thing that says where the story is originating from, they didn't want to say Cohocton because that was a little far away and it was hard to pronounce and spell. So they would all just say Howell. But Howell's the one that bore the scars of his reputation in there, but he wasn't from Howell. He didn't live in Howell when he was the Grand Dragon. He lived in Cohocton.
Right.
Despite Robert Miles actually being from Cohocton, Michigan, stories have painted Howell, Michigan out to be Robert Miles' stomping grounds. These stories come from parents, they come from media articles, but they also come from people as high up as the President of the United States. Just a few years ago, President Joe Biden visited Howell to talk about his infrastructure bill. And as you'll see, President Biden even furthered on this inaccurate generalization based on only a small germ of the truth.
It starts at the top. So President Biden was here, and he spoke about a mile from this house. And he spoke, and in his speech, he said,
Americans of all political views stepped up. I'm not being sentimental here. There was racial discrimination was a fact of life. We know how deep-rooted racism is in this country. We saw the Klan marching here in Howell generations ago, and again in recent years.
He even propelled the negative of Howell when he was standing in Howell.
When the President of the United States says something like that, it gives those who haven't looked into the actual history of it a bad idea of what actually happened here in Howell, Michigan. That speech was seen all around the country, and it really makes you question what image did that paint in the head of outsiders about Howell, Michigan. So with that being said, I asked them. I showed them this clip, and this is their actual result of what they thought happened based on the words that their President of the United States told them.
So, tell me what pops into your head. Just paint the picture after you hear the quote.
I thought of a street in Howell where people marching down, in robes, chanting racist things.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know. When the Klan was really big, you always just think of the burning crosses in people's yards and the get up.
How many people would you think were marching?
Hundreds at least. Maybe not thousands because it's a smaller town, but definitely it's a large crowd.
As you'll hear momentarily, there wasn't hundreds of people marching. They weren't burning crosses. And I don't blame Sophia and Demetrius because they're outsiders. They haven't looked into the history of this. But that's the image that was painted into their head. And that was the image that was painted into so many outsiders' heads when they hear that. Let's talk to Mr. Earl and Mr. Morehouse to see what actually happened and to see the truth behind the incident that President Biden was referring to in his speech.
Well, there is this little germ of truth in what he said. The Klan never marched in Howell, but I think it was 1994, an out-of-state group came to Michigan and they targeted certain communities where they wanted to hold a Klan rally on the local building there. They did it in Lansing, they did it in Ann Arbor, and they did it in Howell. They weren't even from Michigan. They were from out of the state. But they came here and they exploited the rule that said that any group can hold a rally on the front steps of the county courthouse. So in 1994, there was a Klan rally. I think there were maybe 8 or 10 Klansmen who were there that took place on the steps of the Livingston County Courthouse. The response to it was they ended up erecting this enormous fence around the outside of the courthouse, like a Grand River, and next to it, down where the amphitheater is and all that. They wanted to block it all off so people couldn't even get close to it. And then they encouraged everybody to just stay away. The community's reaction to it was wonderful. They didn't just say, we're just going to let this happen. They hit it head on. It was led by the Chamber of Commerce. Did a tremendous job of repelling this. Rally came and went. It was these, speakers came. There really weren't a lot of people that came to watch it. And then when they left, they held a ceremonial washing of the steps, where they washed off the steps where these guys were standing. So when Biden's speechwriter says they were marching in the street, this is how they were marching in the streets not too long ago. The Klan was marching in the streets. Maybe technically that was true, but it's not accurate at all. It's not accurate because these people had nothing to do with Howell. They did the same thing in Ann Arbor and the same thing in Lansing, and he didn't mention that at all. He was doing that to try to say, I'm coming to this racist community, this community that has a history with the Klan, and I'm doing it. Nothing's happened since then, making it seem like, every Friday night there'd be a Klan parade down Grand River, and that never happened, ever.
Yeah, when you said again,
Ever.
in recent
We
years,
find
nothing.
people throw that out too, that there were like Klan parades and how there's never been any evidence ever. I've go on newspapers.com and long before my time look up issues of the Livingston County Press and other sources in there, and there's never ever any evidence any of that happened.
I'm here talking to you on the very steps that those evil men from Indiana spoke on all those years ago. But what's even cooler is that once those men left, the community came here and had a ceremonial washing of the steps to wash away all the evils that they brought. This further shows that the community did not support their actions. The community did not support the Klan, and the community did not support the racism. In fact, they fought against it and tried to erase it every single time that they possibly could. Unfortunately, the community cannot wash away inaccurate media articles online that reopened inaccurate wounds of Howell's past.
I'm going to answer your question. I'll first say that history is extremely important, and we all should know our history, and everybody should know it. They need to know the accurate history. Now, that being said, bringing up something that happened, like I said, 40 some years ago, I think that there's some element of trying to get people to click on it to make money. Ultimately, they want readership, they want clicks, they want things, so that you need to put something up there that's of interest. Like, hey, if I see something like this, I'm going to click on it and read it. I used to be on the phrase, hey, let's talk about it, let's talk through it. But when you keep talking it over and over and over again, it gets to be a broken record and you don't feel like you're making any progress. So now I'm of the opinion, hey, if you want to have a legitimate conversation about something on an anniversary or something like that, that's okay. If it was just some random date in 2021, well, what was the point? What was the agenda behind the person who wrote the article and published the article?
I probably more than anyone have talked about this issue, and every time I bring it up, anytime I write about it in the Livingston Post or anytime I talk to anyone about it, you get this mixed bag of people going, why do you keep talking about this guy who's been dead for 31 years? Leave it alone. He is not Howell. He never was Howell. Why do you keep bringing him up? Why do you keep talking about him? And then I have other people who are like fascinated to know the history of it. And when I do bring them up, the only reason I do it now is so that people know that the truth of what happened, and so that people know that Howell does not deserve its reputation, because its reputation largely is built on the fact that 30, 40, 50 years ago, there was not a Klan, but there was a Klansman who lived here, who was very famous, who held rallies on his property. There was no active Ku Klux Klan ever in Howell. And when I do bring it up, it's so that people know the truth, and they know the real story behind it, and they know how the rumors started and the reputation started and why it's unfounded. And I really want everyone in Michigan to know that Howell, for whatever issues we might have on there, we are not a hotbed of racism. We are not the home of the Klan. We never were the home of the Klan in here.
But a lot of them still paint Howell in that negative light. And I don't want to generalize all media articles and all media outlets, because there are a lot of good ones that paint the accurate truth and educate people on the history of what actually happened. But with that being said, there are still a handful of articles that counter the truth with negative painted picture about Howell, Michigan. And as Mr. Earl talked about, we do need to know our history. So posting articles to remind people of the true, accurate history is good. If you're posting on a certain date that happened in time, like on Robert Miles' death, if you post something on that date talking about the accurate history of it, how it doesn't link directly to Howell as much as everybody thinks it does, that's good. We're educating people. That's what we need in today's society. But if you're posting something random and inferring that there was an active Klan and it's bringing hate in Howell, that's inaccurate. And what image is that spreading? What image is that painting in people's heads? Is it accurate or is it furthering this connotation?
For me, I think it's a negative. I do believe I'm always a big proponent of you do need to know your history. It's not something we can hide. It existed, it happened. But at the same time, we can watch for the positive progression and leave that behind and be able to move us forward as a community.
We see the people within the community say that articles like these are negative articles and that it does hurt those inside the community and it has a negative effect on those inside the community just as much as it would as those on the outside of the community. Reoccurring media articles talking about Robert Miles 30, 40 years later continues and furthers this connotation with Howell. And media articles rarely ever talk about Howell's thriving African American community pre-Robert Miles days. They rarely ever talk about figures like George Jewett or Lulu Childers or Abraham Lotsford. And outsiders, they get to know the idea of Howell and the KKK and Robert Miles, but they rarely ever know the figures before them and the African American figures that thrived in Howell before them.
You've heard a lot about the KKK in Howell.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of George Jewett or Abraham Lotsford or Lulu Childers?
No, I have not.
Have
Yes.
you ever heard about George Jewett or Abraham Lotsford or Lulu Childers?
No.
George Jewett was not only the first head coach of the Howell High School football team, but was the first African American high school football coach in the state of Michigan, and potentially the nation. He went on to be the first African American football player at the University of Michigan and the University of Northwestern, which is now honored on a national scale by the universities in the form of a trophy. Here in Howell, we honor him with a street sign, but many, both inside the community and out, still don't know his history within the community. Abraham Lotsford was Howell's first African American resident. Lotsford escaped slavery and fled to Howell in 1854, where he opened a barber shop that lasted for years with the help of the Howell community. Lulu Childers is a Howell High School valedictorian who later went on to become Howard University's music director from 1905 to 1942. Childers fought hand in hand with Marian Anderson to overcome racial DAR policies, which previously only allowed white people to perform at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. This was a fight that Childers and Anderson won, which led to Anderson performing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to 75,000 people, with thousands more listening at home on radios. One of those individuals was 10-year-old Martin Luther King, who's talked about the significance that moment had on him and his career, partially inspiring him to give his I Have a Dream speech in the exact same spot 24 years later. Childers often returned home to Howell during her career, before she returned to Howell for good to live out the rest of her life. Lulu is currently buried in Howell's Lakeview Cemetery, with her life and legacy being honored and linked to Howard University through the Lulu Very Childers Hall on Howard's campus. For Howard University, it was a no-doubter to talk about and recall Childers' history. Yet, people don't take those same efforts when linking her to her hometown. Outsiders know a lot about the KKK and Robert Miles' history, but they're rarely reminded of people like George Jewett, Abraham Lotsford, or Lulu Childers, who are significant African American figures in the United States who had ties to Howell, but they're rarely remembered of that.
I'll say it this way: I think that as much as there's reoccurring negative stories that come out to repeat and rehash the story that's old, I think there needs to be on the opposite side. Let's rehash the George Jewett story and the Lulu Childers story, and let's tell those stories.
If the media covered some of that history about Lulu Childers or about George Jewett, do you think that could potentially change people's minds or influence people's opinions on Howell?
I think that it could definitely be a positive influence if they covered things like that.
As we've already seen, outsider Demetrius Tyson believes that if we talk more about this, it'll give people a more positive look on Howell, and not only that, a more accurate look as well. However, it's not just media articles that portray this image. Online posts on Twitter, on Instagram, on social media in general, they also further this negative connotation about the community.
You can go on Twitter or Google, if you type in Howell, Michigan, KKK, all this stuff pops up. All these things pop up. All these people going, yeah, oh yeah, Howell's the home of the Klan.
I'm sure the people making those posts weren't trying to have a negative impact to those on the outside of the community or those on the inside of the community, but after listening to this story from Mr. Morehouse, I want you to think of how posting messages like this online impact both those on the inside and those on the outside. And if posting inaccurate messages saying that Howell's the home of the Klan or the Klan started in Howell, if those help or hurt people on the outside of the community and in.
Because a lot of editors, it was myself and another man named Dennis Keenan who were the two editors of the paper. And we approached things differently than previous editors had. Previous editors ignored Miles or treated him more like a respected member of the community. We did it a little bit differently. When he did something, we publicized it. When he had a big hate rally at his property, we covered it and we wrote about it. He would, anytime we wrote anything about him or about the Klan, he would come into the newspaper and buy copies of the paper, and then he would ask for me to come up, and he wanted to talk to me about what I'd written. And it was all negative stuff, but anytime he came in to the paper, I ended up having to talk to him. Miles would come in and he would tell me how much he loved the fact that we were writing about the Klan and writing about him, because all you're doing is you're helping to scare minorities away from coming here by pointing out that I'm this boogeyman who lives on this farm up here. There's no black person that's ever going to want to come to Livingston County. So he would tell me, he said, you're doing a better job of keeping blacks out of Livingston County than I am. And in still to this day, I don't know if we had the right approach or not, but we were thinking that the public had a right to know what was going on in our community.
Mr. Morehouse had an obligation to post what happened. It was the way that the people of the community stayed involved. He had to post to educate them about what was truly happening within their community. But now in the year 2024, 30 years after most of these events have happened, is posting things like this online, is it helping create a more inclusive society? Or are you doing exactly what Robert Miles would want you to do? Are you furthering his legacy? Are you furthering his message in 2024, over 20 years after he passed away? And the effects aren't only felt by those on the outside of the community, they're felt just as much in those on the inside of the community, as we see Mr. Earl has.
Because what's that insinuating is that my relatives and my friends and my family and my aunts and uncles and everybody were a racist group of people, which they weren't. So you talk to many people who knew the county really well, and it just wasn't prevalent. It just wasn't. It wasn't fact. There was no figures to be able to back that up. Again, it was one guy from 10 miles north of Howell in Cohocton that stirred it up, and it's we're talking about it today in 2024.
So this brings up a question for both outsiders and insiders. What's the answer? We see this inaccurate connotation that's harming those inside the community and those out, but what's the answer? How do we fix it?
Just continue with an open mind and go from their own experiences.
We have to continue to work to make this community as welcoming as we can, and then invite people to come here.
I think they need to come here.
When they see it and experience it for themselves, they get a different idea. When they meet people from Howell, walk around, spend any amount of time here, get involved in a community group, they realize that these biases they had are, and this idea that they had, are not true.
They can read about something about Howell, and I can tell them something about Howell, and we're standing in East Lansing having the conversation. And that person is still only going on what they heard. So if there's an opportunity for that person to ultimately come experience something, farmer's market on a Sunday, a festival, just walking down the street on a Friday night and going to Cleary's or Karate's or wherever, they have to experience it.
If you go there, then you're having an informed opinion. But if you're just basing your opinion on what I've heard or what I've read what somebody's told me, then that's not an informed opinion.
They need to physically come here and experience. So I would say to them, until you've been here and you've met people and you have some experience of being here, you can't just with a wave of a hand, you just think 40,000 people in the Howell area. It's just not fair.
And that's not just true of Howell's reputation, it's true with anybody.
We call this armchair anthropology in my cultural anthropology class at Michigan State University. It's when you're basing your opinion and you're generalizing an entire group of people without actually indulging yourself within that community to get your own experience. Picture you're sitting back in your armchair and you read something in the newspaper, you read something online, you hear a story, and you don't get up off your armchair and you form an opinion about an entire group of people based on what you've read and what you've heard without actually experiencing it for yourself. That's armchair anthropology. As you heard them say, the answer for outsiders is to come to Howell, come to a farmer's market, come to the balloon fest, indulge yourself in the community of Howell, and make your opinions based upon that. With that being said, we can't just sit here and play the victim card the entire time. Howell, Michigan has had isolated incidences of racism, just like any other community, but it's not fair for you to make an assumption about an entire group of people based on the actions of few, just like it isn't fair in any other community. It's not just those on the outside with the obligation to come here to base their opinions. Those on the inside of the community have an obligation as well. If you're on the inside of the community and you hear somebody say something along these lines, you have an obligation to stand up and to educate them on the impacts of those actions. And you have the obligation to call them out and confront them on that action. As a representative of the Howell Public Schools School Board, Mr. Earl agrees with me and wants to continue to push this message to students.
I think you need to confront it right away. I think I said before, you have to aggressively go right after it real quick. So you have to, again, educate. You can't do that. You can't do it, period, wherever you are. But you really can't do it here because that ignites, this false understanding of what Howell is today. And so we have to be on hypersensitive to people who are saying racial things or anything that's negative. So we just have to address that person one-on-one right away. Maybe a freshman in high school and you're talking to a senior saying something, you're like, well, that's intimidating, they can't do that. But they're going to have to talk to the teacher, talk to the administrator, somebody, because you do not want that to get out of hand, and that person needs to be educated.
So looking back about what we've talked about today, it started in the beginning, how we established that those on the outside of the community have this connection with the name Howell to the KKK, and that hurts outsiders in the community. But that generalization about the community of Howell hurts those on the inside as well. So the question is, what steps do we take moving forward to limit this harm for those on both the outside and those on the inside? And my conclusion is that both sides have an obligation. Those on the outside have the obligation to come to Howell, indulge themselves in the community, and base your opinions on the community and the people in it based on your own experiences, and not partake in armchair anthropology and base those opinions on what you've heard or what you've read without actually experiencing it. But those on the inside of the community have the obligation to stand up to any actions that they hear. They have the obligation to educate people and confront them when they hear something like this going on. Because if not, then you're continuing this connotation, you're proving it true. If both sides can fulfill those obligations, I'm confident that we can build a better society of tomorrow. Thank you very much. This is Logan Luppick, signing off.